Welcome back.
Welcome to Decision Space, the only show to take place right here, in the space between the turns in your favorite games. I'm Jake Friedman.
And I'm Brendan Hansen.
And this is the podcast about decisions in games. Yeehaw! Today we're diving deep into the decisions offered in Great Western Trail, a sprawling, entangled, some would say lovely, others would say messy game. We'll discuss the modular nature of Great Western Trail, the core systems, its entangled strategic paths, interactions, cows, cowboys, engineers, and try to get to the bottom of why we're building a mansion along the trail, and so much more. Brendan, how are you doing today, and are you looking forward to this discussion?
I'm doing really well, Jake. Thanks for asking. And I am looking forward to this discussion. Great Western Trail has this unique place, I would say, in the board game zeitgeist right now, and I think has sort of had that for the last half decade almost. Came out in like 2015, so we're in 2022 now, and I think it's going to be interesting to see where both of us end up. I've had a wild ride along the trail with this game. How are you, Jake? Are you excited?
I'm doing good, and I'm always excited to talk with you and to talk board games. Before we get into this episode, we should give a huge thank you to all of our patrons. They are the ones who selected this game. We have that as one of our Patreon perks if you choose to support the podcast in that way. Every few months or so, we'll put a poll up there and let our Patreon backers select the game. So this is the first one that was chosen not by us, but by them. So, if you're looking forward to this episode, you should give them a big thank you. We are very grateful for their support. And if you're interested and can support the show in that way, you can check out our Patreon at patreon.com/decisionspace, and we'll include a link in the show notes.
Awesome.
Also, for our pre-planners, those who like to play the games along with us in advance, the next game we will be covering, likely in next week's episode, will be Tigris and Euphrates, the classic Reiner Knizia tile placement area control thing. So I'm really looking forward to that discussion. I think it'll be a ton of fun.
This is the first time I've heard Jake is excited about talking about Tigris Euphrates, so I am very excited.
Yeah. I mean, hey, it's a classic game for a reason, and we've certainly given it its fair due in terms of plays at this point.
Now I'm nervous. No
spoilers.
Great Western Trail.
Great Western Trail. Ratings and slogans. I think I'm going to change it up, and I'm going to give mine first this time.
Do it.
So, Great Western Trail, I'm going to give this game a 5 out of 10.
Ooh.
So, all right, I know a lot of people are probably just turning this podcast off right now. But, to me, I've played it a lot. It isn't a game that really has stuck with me in a way that makes me want to keep revisiting it. And in fact, it's kind of been, as we've played it so much to prepare for this show, it's kind of been a game that has become a little bit of a drag to continue to play. And that's really only happened to me a few times in this podcast, in this experience. So I think, I want to be objective and I want to take note of when that's happening. And that's unfortunately the experience that I've been having playing this game is like, Brendan invited me to another game of Great Western Trail. I guess I'll do it. But I just haven't been having as much fun as so many others do with this game. And I think the big reason for that is, and we'll get much more into this in the episode, is for a game that is all about building a path. Ironically, I feel like, or maybe this makes perfect sense and isn't ironic at all, I feel as though I get too limited and too, focused into a single path as I play this game, that it starts to feel like it's kind of playing itself in a way that my turns become really obvious. So that's my big criticism, and we'll certainly get into that much more. But I feel like I'm going to be much lower than Brendan, which is why I wanted to go first. So let's get to maybe a more positive one. Brendan, will you please give us your rating and slogan for the game?
I'm so excited for this episode now. There are many along the board game trail who would suggest that Great Western Trail is one of the best designed board games of all time. Clearly not Jake. I found myself captivated by its energy, entangled strategic paths, and sheer variability, mostly afforded to it by its brilliant run-tell and building system. There's this driving force to the decisions offered to players in Great Western Trail that feel at times, in the best way, like running down a hill with the wind in your hair. Mostly, Great Western Trail is an exercise in prudence, tying skill to a player's ability to not dally along the trail and stop frugally only at times when they absolutely must. There's brilliant fun and beauty in Great Western Trail's design, but at the end of the day, I wish it offered more meaningful tools for interaction on the board other than just blunting and taxing, which saps some of the energy the game has out of it. For me, Great Western Trail, though, eclipses these and manages to be a solid 8 out of 10.
All right. Well, there you have a pretty good spread in our reviews. And I think maybe it's worth mentioning, too, very briefly, that we typically are rating these games based on the Board Game Geek general scale for rating games. So a 5 isn't a pan as much as it is like, this is an average game that I could kind of take or leave. If somebody brought it out, I wouldn't necessarily say, no way, I refuse to play that, but probably wouldn't seek out myself. Where this is a game that Brendan, it sounds like, would certainly recommend or potentially bring out with other folks and be excited to get it to the table many more times.
Definitely. I think that's absolutely right. It's been a game we'll get into it. Let's talk about the background.
This game was designed by Alexander Pfister, who notably did 2 games I absolutely love in 2015, Broom Service, we've covered on this podcast, and Isle of Skye from Chieftain to King. And that's one that I'm constantly recommending to people. I think it fills a great niche in the board game collection. And then more recently, Pfister has put out games like Maracaibo, another game that really rose and received a lot of great critical acclaim. There are a few smaller ones in there too. And I know Boone Lake is a very recent release that's getting a ton of press right now. When it comes to Great Western Trail itself, it kind of has a long history and a promising future. So this game originally, as Brendan mentioned, came out in 2016, where it was immediately just a massive hit. This game was everywhere at that time. It received a second edition in 2021, which is what we have been playing. And I do believe that tweaked things a little bit. So sort of a patch type of thing to the game. Not just a straight reprint.
I think visually, it's definitely a patch. It updates a lot of the aesthetics of the game. It updates some of the things about the presentation, just within the cultural context of the game. And I will say that I was much more excited to play the second edition because of that than I was the first. Also, the look and feel is just nice. And the cowboy meeples with their little hats are adorable.
Do you know off the top of your head, like what the problematic
so
in the first edition? This is news to me.
I do. So in the version we play, Jake, there's the loop where you will have run-ins with outlaws, and you can potentially gain money from removing those outlaws from the board, right? So in the original version of Great Western Trail,
I know where this is going.
Yeah, that same path was representing Native Americans,
right?
That I believe in the rulebook called, and I'm going to quote Indians, and then. Basically, like how it contextualizes your interaction with Native Americans on the Great Western Trail is it was saying you were trading, but that's not the experience in a lot of ways. That was like, it just, I don't know. I think they made a positive change, moving those to be outlaws. I think it fits the aesthetic better. And I think it fits what's happening mechanically through play better. So we'll be referring to the outlaws, and that's where, the second edition ended up.
Great. Thank you. Good to know. Yeah. And then upcoming, I think there have been announced 3 new additions or like follow-ups to Great Western Trail that are coming out. In 2022, there will be an Argentina version. And in 2023, a New Zealand version. Is there going to be one more after that as well? Or was the second edition the first of the 3?
The second edition was the first of the 3. And just 2 days ago, maybe it was even yesterday, there is an expansion to Great Western Trail that was previously just for the first edition, and now they've announced that they're bringing that to the second edition presentation and print as well. So that's another sort of piece in this line of updated aesthetics that's coming.
Yeah. All right. So with that in mind, just really briefly, are you excited to check out these new versions of this game when they release?
I'm excited to see how different they are from Great Western Trail. If they're presented as riffs on Great Western Trail that share 75% of the or more of the DNA, probably not for me. I'm happy to have played Great Western Trail, and I'll probably stick with this, even if those games are said to be, oh, it's just such an amazing refined version. If they share 50% of the DNA and there's a lot of sort of different things happening, I think that could be really exciting. I don't necessarily think that's going to be the angle that the games take. How about you, Jake?
Not just because I don't have as favorable of an opinion of Great Western Trail, but I think almost in any game, it'd be like that's just doing like a new version and a new location. It's definitely would be a wait and see for me, you know. But I mean, there's Castles of Burgundy and then Castles of Tuscany, and those are very different offerings. So if it's something like that, then sure, I could be potentially interested. Uh,
Totally. And sheep
yeah,
are cool. Sheep are
yeah, I
cool.
think yeah, but if it's just like Great Western Trail, the
With
same
sheep.
mechanics and like a slightly different map and buildings and it's sheep, like pass
Yeah.
probably.
Yeah.
But if you're a massive fan of this, then of course you want to try it out. And this game was published, we said, in 2016 by Eggert Spiel, 1 to 4 players. Brendan, will you please provide your usual game synopsis and rules overview right now?
Great Western Trail is a sprawling, loop-building hand management game that casts players as ranchers, taking their hand of cows for delivery at the end of a looping trail. Play of Great Western Trail primarily takes place on a shared central board that depicts action locations represented by buildings organized in a loop. On the trail are branching paths, hazards, shared public buildings, and locations for players to build their own private buildings, altering their own options and potentially taxing or slowing down their opponents. Each turn, players move their rancher along the path up to a certain number of building spaces ahead. If they opt to stop at a public building or their own private building, they carry out the actions depicted on it. These actions might enable them to craft their hand of cows to make for a more lucrative hand once they reach the end of the trail, purchase new cow cards, move along an important railroad track tied to income and point scoring associated with deliveries at the trail end, build buildings to enhance their future trips along the trail, clear hazards to make the path more traversable, or hire employees, making them more effective at raising cattle, building buildings, and running up the railroad track. Great Western Trail is all about doing just enough along the trail to improve your position without spending time taking extraneous actions that would be wonderful to have time for, but ultimately slow the player down too much. Once a player reaches the end of the loop, they receive income based on the combined value of unique cow cards in their hand, which is moderately taxed based on how far up the railroad track they've gone so far. After delivering, they move their rancher back to the start of the loop and take another trip around the trail. The game's timer is controlled by the number of loops taken overall, so there's strong incentive to keep moving down the trail. The income system encourages players to take their time and craft a strong hand. There's real tension there. Layered over all of this are objective cards players can draft for accomplishing certain tasks, and the game's player interaction comes from competition for limited resources in the cattle market, along the railroad track, and on the map itself, where players choose to build buildings in private locations can highly impact the overall shape of the decision space. It's important to take note that buildings included in each play are variable, and the location of public buildings are randomized as well, making the game's decision space variable. At game end, players tally their points, which come from cowboys they've added to their hand, cows they've added to their hand, not cowboys, buildings they've built, hazards they've cleared, objectives they've accomplished, stations and cities they've delivered to, money they have remaining, and employees they've hired. The player with the most points is crowned the victor.
Thank you, Brendan. That was fantastic. 10 out of 10. As always, my friend, thank you for doing that.
Thank you. That was a big one. I don't know how I did it.
Okay, well, let's get straight into the deep dive portion of this episode. As we always do, let's start first by characterizing the decision space in Great Western Trail, starting with let's start with like the type. What is the overall type of this decision space to you? And I think it's a tricky one.
Well, this is really interesting because now I'm going off of thinking about your comments and feedback about the game. How I think mechanically a lot of the game feels like a waxing decision space. Over the game, you're growing in terms of your agency, improving your board so that whenever you do these sort of little actions like gaining money or drawing cards, you can do more of those things. Whenever you're moving, you can move further. Whenever you have more cards in your hand, which should allow you to get more money and do more things. But I think in reality, and based on what you said, Jake, I think the decision space in terms of the feasible decisions maybe does wane a little bit. And just because you're doing more expensive things, more enticing things that are down the decision paths a little bit, doesn't mean you're necessarily actually making more decisions, which might be an interesting distinction of Great Western Trail, right? Just because your experience of agency in the game feels like it's growing doesn't necessarily mean that you're making more decisions or doing more with it. And I think in Great Western Trail, it seems like you're sort of doing the same. Though importantly, I do think how you enhance and augment the board is the big factor that changes this here. I think if you are building buildings out of the board, it is changing how you can make decisions. And certainly it waxes a little bit at the start as you piece together what your path will be and figure out how you're going to work around your opponents. What do you think?
I do agree in kind of what you're getting at when you have this sense of like waning decisions as you kind of at the beginning of the game, your paths, and we'll talk kind of about like what the traditional types of builds as like your strategic path to go down are. And at the beginning of the game, of course, that's wide open. You could pursue any strategy, but I've found in my place that once you start pursuing a strategy, the game really incentivizes you to continue down that path in a lot of ways, which can make that, actual, the objective decision space, as we might describe it, right? You have a larger decision space. You can move further. You can do different things, but like what you're actually viable to pursuing that strategy that you've already chosen sort of shrinks down a bit. So I think in that way, it feels kind of waning from the strategic horizon perspective. But when I think about like how many viable options I have on my turns, I don't think that really changes very much over the course of the game, which kind of gives it a fairly static feel. So I'm kind of like between those two. I'm not sure what side I come down on, but I definitely don't get a waxing impression at all, just in my experience playing this game. And I feel like the constraints around, how many viable decisions, like what your strategic horizons are at any time, definitely don't change dramatically enough to, again, give me a sense that, okay, no, it's really a dynamic space because sometimes it's big and sometimes it's small because it's all so tightly confined.
I think Great Western Trail, it might be one of those games where different plays are going to take different shapes for different players because there is the potential for you to approach the game strategically quite differently, right? So I've definitely had plays where maybe in a 3-player game where my opponents don't end up putting that many buildings on the board and I am able to upgrade movement on my board early so I can move 5 spaces. Sometimes that will give me the sense of that sort of energy that I was talking about where I'm zipping around the board, just running loops around my opponents. And there I feel the waxing a little bit just because I'm looking at more options of buildings. But there's also, in contrast, other plays where the building is totally clogged with, or the board, excuse me, is totally clogged with buildings. I constantly have no money because everyone has, blunted what we can do. And there I feel like the decision space really shrinks. So to me, I don't necessarily feel like I'm always doing about the same because how much money I have really affects my agency and what spaces I can stop at versus what spaces I have to stop at and what I can do there. But I agree on average. I think it wanes in nature as the game goes on just by necessity of pursuing the strategy that you've run towards.
Right.
It values strategic commitment to some extent.
Yeah, and even in your example of like where you've upgraded movement, there aren't so many buildings on the board. Like you might be pursuing in that case a strategy of like getting to the end of the line and making many deliveries of cows, right? Like that's sort of in the benefit of having that movement. One of the benefits at that point. So like, is moving one space like really something you're going to consider in that situation? Like, yeah, it's an option, maybe on a very fringe case, it's like, okay, I like absolutely have to have that
Yeah.
space to complete an objective or something. But I think like in general, just because you're moving 5, you're still probably mostly exploring the decision space that is like, what if I move 4? What if I move 5?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's true.
Let's move on from that and sort of like what other kind of thoughts you have about the decision space in this game. Like, let's talk about like the size. I think we've kind of gotten to that a little bit. Like, how many things are you really considering on your turn? Because I feel like the decision space turn to turn is really small. Like almost
Mm.
like feeling it almost feels like kind of like a little micro turn in some sense.
That's really interesting. I feel like the things that I'm considering are the job market, the cattle market, usually, not always. If I don't have cowboys or very many cowboys, then I'm not. If I don't have money, I'm probably not looking at those things, but I'm always looking at the job market. And I am looking at the buildings on the board. But to your point, I think one interesting thing about Great Western Trail is how the buildings that are used in a given game, because the buildings are modular,
Mm-hmm.
come out and where people build really matters at the start. And then once those decisions are made, their impact is felt turn to turn, but you're not reconsidering the consequences of
Right.
them once you've experienced them. Um, so I guess for me, it feels huge, and then it shrinks and comes into focus and really narrows.
Like that first turn of the game where you can start anywhere on the trail. It's like, yeah, you have a lot of options and it's going to be really impactful what you pick. But once you're on the trail, like once you're in the middle of the game, I mean, I'm not looking necessarily at, I'm not starting my turn saying like, what's the job market? What's the cattle market? Like my thought process is like, okay, what spaces can I move to? Okay, there's 2 that are like, not my opponent's spaces or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And then I'm just looking at, okay, well, this, I feel like so many times I get into a situation, you just find yourself in a situation. I don't think this is a result of like good or bad play, where it's like, okay, I can move to 2 spaces. This one
Mm.
is like good, benefits my strategy that I'm already pursuing, helps me get an objective task that I need. Uh, this one, I don't have the type of cow card in my hand to get the bonus for it, and it's just way less optimal. So like I feel like a good proportion of my turns of this are honestly like not decisions at all. Like you can
Mm.
just so quickly narrow down to a single space, and then once you get into a space, some of them are really interesting, right? Like and create a bigger decision space. Like if you're building buildings and have many different options, but I think the vast majority of them are pretty straightforward.
I feel like part of that too, and just to take a step back, I think in general, we try to avoid getting too deep in the conversation of strategy and tactics on the show, whether or not a game focuses more on strategy or more on tactics. And I think we've sort of tabled that lens in pursuit of others. And Great Western Trail might be a good time to bring it back and talk about it a little bit. Because I feel like partially what you're saying too, Jake, is I think Great Western Trail is a game of high in terms of the decisions are offered. Their strategic decisions are highly emphasized and consequential, and the tactical decisions feel somewhat wrote and dictated by the strategic decisions you're making. And I think that's what you're running up against, right? Like I made these decisions, so in my turn to turn, I'm bored because I must do X.
I think that's a great point. And I should also highlight the fact that I've played this game once in person on the table, and I played this game a lot asynchronously. So when
Mm.
and that might, and I think it probably is the case that a lot of that frustration is really highlighted by that asynchronous play, where it's like I click on the game, it loads the board, I have to like look at all these different things to like remember what objectives I'm pursuing, what workers I have, uh, what cards I have in my hand, where I'm at, where my train is at
Mm.
on the trail, and then I have to look at all that, and then I then can look at what's in front of me and like, okay, I don't even have any options here, so I just like do the thing. Like that was not fun, and I think that
Yeah.
like creates this impression that this game on a turn to turn basis, like for me, is not very engaging or exciting. However, of course, if you zoom that lens out to like not thinking about like is this fun like turn to turn, but like because you can totally, plan like 3 turns down the line in this game, right? Like I'm gonna go here, get some money, then I'm gonna go here, get this, and then I'm gonna go to a third space, or then I'm selling, and I'll likely have X amount of, I'm gambling. I'm gonna have like this amount of cattle points in my hand, so that I'll be able to deliver at this particular station, which gives me this. Like that is fun, right?
Yeah.
That actually enables some amount of critical thinking, um, you know, but then you're just implementing it.
In practice on turn to turn. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that one interesting thing to provide some context. So this game, the first time I started playing it was on Board Game Arena in December, and it is nearly the end of March now, as of the time of recording this. And I had this really wild, I really liked Great Western Trail. Obsessed with it, couldn't stop thinking of it, played a ton of games. Really crested, came down, and I was like, I really don't like this game. There's so much that's bugging me. And I've come back up as I've been able to appreciate. I think I came into it and I was like, wow, this is amazing. My tactical decisions are fun. My strategic decisions are fun. Then I sort of came down and I was like, I'm not loving my turn to turn decisions in this game. I don't feel like I'm solving an interesting puzzle. And then I think the more I played, the more I appreciated how different games, how differently they would play out, and how synergies between certain buildings being in the pool, how the market would shape out, that the strategic puzzle became really interesting. And I think we both have a preference for games with really interesting tactical puzzles. And I've come to appreciate more and more as the more I've played, the greater fun of cracking the strategic nut of a given game. And it is a slower burn. So that's how I've sort of come to enjoy it more, is like exploring these hybrid strategies where I'm not just like, okay, this game I'm doing big cows and I'm only getting cowboys and I'm putting all my money into buying these cow cards to get my points. Or this game I'm just trying to get to the end of the track with my engineers, and that's what I'm doing. I'm going to push this button 6 times. And sort of been like, can I go into builders and use that to play into cowboys? Or can I get one cowboy and use that to enable good deliveries for builders? And what does that look like? So I think that if you're a person who likes tactical decisions, this might not be a decision space for you. And that, to me, that's a really interesting thing. And I think it's also why Great Western Trail is still talked about as much as it is now, because the people who want that strategic meaty stew found a strategic meaty stew that is always going to be different, but familiar and fun.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it also gives me a little bit of hope, because my kind of process with this, thinking about this game, really is mirrored the first 2 parts, right? Like I really did enjoy this game a lot. I was excited to play it more and explore it more. But that excitement has just like consistently waned to the point now where I feel like I'm at rock bottom. Like I don't think I keep playing this and I'll be like, oh, now I think this game is bad. I don't think
You'd rather play Praga.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which I think is actually a great comparison to this game, is one I was thinking about as well, in the sense that like I feel like a lot of turns in Praga are also play out for you.
Sure.
You look at the board and evaluate, and it's like, okay, well, obviously I take the most incentivized action, and out of those 2, there's only one that helps me.
Yeah.
So I think it has that like similar frustration. And interestingly, the more I've played Praga, I feel like I am kind of now coming up on an upswing, as started high, went lower, and now going back up. So I wouldn't be surprised if, in a year from now, if I have a better impression of this game, if I play it more.
Sure. Which we'll see if it can live up to that. I have another. I'm curious, Jake. So we talked about the first decision of the game.
Yeah.
Can I want to bounce something off of you. Sometimes in film criticism, you'll talk about the opening shot of a movie, right, as being this really powerful moment for the director to establish what the film is going to be about, or to just imbue the whole experience with real energy, right?
What's the first thing you see?
Literally the first thing you see, right? So I think that we have an opportunity with our lens to talk about the first decision in a game. And some games don't use this in an interesting way. The first decision you make isn't that much different than a lot of the other decisions you make, and it might be equally consequential. But Great Western Trail does not just start you at the beginning of the trail. It sort of said, it has this single moment where you get to choose wherever you would like to start out of all of the public buildings that start seeded onto the board. And for me, it sort of does become this really cool opening decision moment. That's a treatise on what this is about, which is a game about understanding how the buildings have randomly seeded onto the board, what the relationship between them is, and how that's going to shape what buildings are good, what actions are going to be emphasized in this game, and what actions are going to be worse. Because if things come consistently towards the end of the trail, people are going to find themselves without as much money. It's going to be more difficult, potentially, unless they augment their trail, more difficult to utilize them efficiently. So part of my joy has just been in learning how to interpret the puzzle and make interesting first decisions. So I love that about this game. I think that's one of my favorite things. I think that could also be a criticism, right? If one of my favorite things is interpreting the puzzle at the very beginning of the game and the first decision I make,
Right.
that could spell disaster. Why not?
It certainly gives credence to this argument that this is like mostly a strategic game, right?
Sure.
In a mostly strategic game, of course, your most impactful, important, and fun decisions are going to be front loaded.
Yeah.
Because that's how strategy works.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's really cool too. I think it's a really interesting thing to highlight, and but also in practice, like, do you find yourself gravitating towards like what are some spaces that you like first? Do you really feel like it's wide open, or do you feel like you're mostly going to be putting down a building or getting some workers first?
Yeah, in practice, you're doing one of those two things typically, right? Yeah,
which kind of gets back to my point where it's like, the space is like, it ends up being kind of small, even if it presents bigger.
I think that there are times where you start with maybe a strong hand, and there's and those actions are towards the beginning of the trail. So you make the decision to make an early delivery. You go to the end of the trail, such that you can take some action that's going to be moderately beneficial, deliver, get a boost of money, and then maybe double hire on your next time around. And I like that decision.
That's cool,
because double hiring is so good.
Right.
It's like potentially one of the most valuable things you can do, especially early in the game. If you can hire 2 employees who are really the employees are the engine of this game in a lot of ways. If there's so many systems in this game, right? There's the rondel, there's handcrafting, there's buildings that you're adding to board. There's this it's not pun based. I shouldn't say that. There's a railroad track that's an actual track that you're moving down. But really the employees dictate what you can do and how much you can do and why you might do something, as much as the scoring incentives do.
Definitely.
So maybe we talk about that.
Yeah.
Because this could be like hiring employees, the game.
Yeah, I think like, and when I say this game feels like it focuses you into a specific strategic path, that's what I'm referring to. It's like, what type of worker are you prioritizing? And so there's cowboys, builders, and engineers. And let's talk about all of them, but
okay,
just on that strategic path thing, like, it feels like is really cowboys and engineers to me as like the ones that really make sense to like pursue as a main strategy.
Okay, so I think that my path with the game, when I came in, I was all team big cowboys. I'm just riding my herd of cattle. I want to buy all of the juicy 5s and 4s and get all the amazing points printed on them. And I was like, I'll just hire all these nice little cowboys. They're going to buy me these cows and I'm going to do what it is, which is Great Western Trail. I'm going to take the cows. Then I was like, okay, wait, I need to branch out. If I'm doing cowboys, I'll do engineers. So then I got some comfort with engineers. I said, okay, I'll move down this trail. But then I was like, this builder, she looks very nice. Maybe I should, the buildings are fun. You can upgrade things. And if I put this here, then other people are going to have to change what they do. And I started exploring builders. And now I think builders are my favorite way to play.
Really? And you've had success with that strategy compared to the others?
I think builders are really hard as a strategy if you're just doing builders. Right. I think it's tough to like go all the way in on builders in the way that you can go all the way in on cowboys or all the way in on engineers. And with builders, to some extent, you have to have a little bit of a hybrid approach where like I'll pick up 1 cowboy or 2 cowboys, which will help me on the efficiency side of just making sure I can upgrade my deck a little bit, and then get my buildings going. And I think buildings for me are all about efficient paths to money. And it all depends too. Some games builders are better when you can end up in situations where you have two really synergistic buildings that play off each other. And also, if your opponents aren't pursuing building as much, you can end up in two spots that are really synergistic. And there's buildings that let you move after using them. So if I can, because no one else is building, if I can claim two spots, maybe, at the beginning of the board, Jake, that southern area,
Mm-hmm.
the sort of marshland behind the floodwaters, that give you, that's what it is, that give you extra benefit for discarding gray cards. I found that can be really effective if other people aren't going for it. And I don't see in the early game a lot of water hazards. I'll sort of like camp out there and really push on just discarding cards and trying to get money that way. And it's been fun and efficient. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll have to take your word for that because I've definitely have pursued all three strategies in like an academic pursuit and have not been able to unpick that knot with the builders. And like and also I think like from like a competitive perspective, like why try when like the other ones just seem like they flow so effortlessly, and like seem to really snowball just like into themselves.
Yeah. I do think one of my criticisms, right? This might be an important point to talk about it, is like interaction on the board doesn't feel that meaningful. At most, you're taxing each other or forcing people to pay the bank by going through hazards, which is just annoying. It's like, hey, Jake, your life sucks a little bit more today. But I think that critics of that commentary, and maybe I myself am going to be one and refute it, is that the real interaction is around finding the right balance between what employees to be buying, and what you're doing impacts what I want to do, and what Joe over here is doing impacts what each of us want to do, and timing when you're making certain employee purchases, because the cost of them varies greatly, is really important. So that's really the interaction, right? Is how the entangled functions of the employees affect the entangled strategic paths. And if you and me go all in on Cowboys, all of a sudden our Cowboys get way worse. We're competing in the cattle market and we're snatching up all the high value ones, and someone's having to pay to refill it. It just does.
Yeah.
No, it
Yeah.
totally
I
does.
mean, like one tiny little baby action to refill it. Like, I think
I think it adds up. I think it adds
I'm
up.
sure it adds up. I mean, I don't think I've ever taken that action in the all of my
Interesting.
plays. I'd just be like, I'll just like get this like white cow or whatever, or not the
Oh, the
yellow, the
yellow?
yellow.
No, it's garbage. You don't take them. They're so bad. I think those are like the worst card of the game. I think the yellow cows are like worse than the orange Seminole cows, the ones that are in the
I'm fine.
expansion.
I'm fine taking a yellow cow early, getting an
Oh,
income going. I feel like I also want to say for the listeners, not that I'm like good at this game, but this is not one of the ones that you've been like smoking me at. We've definitely gone back and forth about
yeah,
it. Yeah.
definitely. Yeah.
But yeah, I think like I hear what you're saying about interaction in this game, and I too would say like if somebody said there's no interaction in Great Western Trail, I'd be like that's not true. But if somebody said like there's basically no interaction of Great Western Trail, I'd be like that's
That's
correct.
true. Yeah.
So it's like we are talking like degrees here, and I mean like I don't know. It does seem weird to me. I have a sense that like people that love Great Western Trail, and this is maybe just from talking to people in our Discord, where there are like many fans of this, like don't don't feel like Great Western Trail is would fit into that like multiplayer solitaire Euro game in the but I don't know. Like for me, like the interaction, it feels extremely extremely slight.
I think that there can be really intense moments of interaction when the core building happens, when the board is defined. The board starts with relatively some definition in terms of where the public buildings are, and then you define it more by adding your own buildings. And there are moments where you can just punch someone in the gut. Like, like early decision, you go here, then someone puts a building down and it totally messes up everything you're trying to do because for the rest of the game, it's slowing down your path and you really hope to go there and in a frustrating way. But I think after those, it feels roughly as much interactive as Castles of Burgundy does.
That's what I was gonna say. Like I think that's so funny. I was thinking the exact same example. Like
Yeah.
yeah, I think Castle of Burgundy and this feel very analogous in terms of the amount of player interaction. Um, which is to say, there definitely is some, but I don't think like you're playing this game to have like a really strong like interactive experience. with your opponents. Like you're playing this game to like do a shared puzzle that has like slight elements of I mean, as I think about it, I think there's a little bit more in Castle Burgundy, but in either case, like they're kind of in that same tier of like, yeah, there's elements where what your opponents do matter, but you're not really like super interacting with each other. I think I just said the same thing over and over again in the same way, but I think
I
you get what I'm saying.
I think importantly too, in highly strategic games that are built on these sort of entangled strategic paths where decisions here affect how good decisions are over here. One important point that we should make about games like this and why it doesn't necessarily feel as interactive is because if the game pushed us to interact more, we would probably choose not to do that and go do the third thing that would be more incentivized right now, right? So like if you two are like really interacting, if in a 3-player game, if you're really interacting in the cattle market or you're really competing for stations up on the railroad track, I'm probably not going to put my eggs in that basket too and join you in that dance. I'm probably going to focus on finding a more efficient path to points that I'm competing less in. So in that way, the sort of Euro efficiency demands of the game push us in separate directions. There are
Yeah.
times when we will connect, but overall, the incentives of the game and the way it's structured say kind of run in different directions, except where you are going to bump a little bit. So I don't know.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that is exactly the same way it manifests in, so many of these
Castles.
other European Euro efficiency puzzle games. Yeah, Castles are the same way. If somebody's racing out to finish all their ships first, maybe say like, oh, nobody's built many animals, so I'm gonna
I'll do that instead.
Do that instead. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, but we agree, right? In general, it's a low interaction game, though not zero.
And I do wonder, right? Like there's this, one of the reasons for that is that the primary way that we interact with the game, the two ways are our hand and the shared space on the board. Our hand is personal, the board is shared, but the board is only half shared because you can make decisions on the board that affect how effective certain decisions are for me. But I don't care what your spaces are as much for my own actions. I just care that they're there. And
Right.
if they tax me, right, it's not like I can interact with your building, and somewhat necessarily so, because then we don't need to get into why. But basically, like if I could use your buildings, it really disincentivizes you even building it in the first place and like all these other things. So it's like this veneer of shared space when really we're kind of playing in parallel paths, right?
You know what I think it is? I just thought this because what you said is like, this is a strategic game, and what you can interact with is sort of the turn-to-turn tactics, which there are very little impact of. But you can't really interact with somebody's strategy.
Outside of opportunity by taking what they might want.
Right. And if you take what they want, it's like almost like not viable because that's right. Unless you're pursuing the exact same strategy, which we already just said, the game doesn't incentivize necessarily, I guess, except for in a 2-player game. But in a 3 or a 4-player game, if you're just like, okay, somebody needs this worker, so I'm going to take it. Like, unless you're doing that, you're just like spiting, what is it? Like, what's the expression?
Zero sum?
No,
Wait.
like spiting
yourself at
self to spite their.
You're spurring yourself, not the cow. Is that the? You're building a building with
it's like
screws and a hammer.
Spiting. It's like spiting your face to like something your nose.
You're tooting the locomotive where no one's around to hear it.
Cutting off one's nose to spite one's face. There it is, Brendan.
So there's a decision that kind of ties into this, actually. The objectives, Jake.
Oh my god, we're getting off the rails. Let's get back.
No, we're on the rails. This exact
the
decision.
Rails.
Yeah, we're on the rails.
The choo-choo rails, if you will.
Exactly. And I think I want to talk about the decisions around the objective cards. What do you think of the objective cards? What do you think about the decisions they offer? And how interesting are they? And then maybe we can talk about the deliveries after that, because those are like the two decision points.
I think those are my 2 favorite parts of the game. I like the objectives. I think they give you like the ability. Something we talked a lot about on the show is like the ability to like call your shot. So it gives you that opportunity of like a smaller term strategic planning or like a tactical thing where it's like, I think at this point in the game, I can take this objective and I'll have the time to do space, X and Y in order to get these missing tasks.
Really quickly, I don't think I covered this in the rules overview, so just too much. There's this objective system in the game where you have your hand of cattle cards that you're trying to efficiently manage, and you can add these objective cards to your deck, and they don't do anything when they're in your deck. They don't increase your income, and you can either leave them in your deck, and they'll just make you a little bit less efficient, or you can play them for an action. But if you play them for an action, you've committed to achieving that objective. At which point, if you don't do it, you'll get negative points. Whereas if you just leave it in your deck, you don't get negative points for it. It just gives you an efficiency.
But I think the game super incentivizes you to play something once it's in your hand, right? Like,
It
how can you
feels
not almost?
really tough to not want to play the objectives once you draw them. Yeah, I completely agree.
And just because like that, so then it's gonna like you're just gonna deliver to a worse station and get less money, and that's just seems like a bigger drawback than potentially losing 2 or 3 points. And you also get the extra incentive to play it, which is that many, if not all, of the objectives give you a special ability when you play it, which is maybe like 2 coins or moving 3 spaces further down the trail, or discarding a couple of cards from your hand and refilling to hopefully get better cows to deliver, which I like too. I think that is fun, and it's something that can kind of spice up a turn that, as we've mentioned, like on turn to turn, can be really rote and actually like open up the decision space a little bit more. Yeah, so I think it's fun.
I also really like that fundamentally Great Western Trail has a time limit on the game based on the number of players that are in it and the deliveries that happen, right? Because every time you deliver in this game, the job market fills up a little bit more and it pushes the game end timer further. So the more there's a certain number of loops that all players are going to get to take. So understanding how fast people are moving around the board and when the game is going to end becomes a core skill. And I like that the objective system matches this, because those small little actions can be really impactful early. So if I think the game is going to go longer because people are going to either fill the game up with buildings and we're not going to be able to upgrade our movement, or we're not, I don't know, that's basically the reason. Or people are really just going to every single building because they have this really efficient chain of buildings close together rather than buildings spread out. So the game goes longer because they're making these quick stops. Then maybe I'm going to play more objectives in the mid game because I know it's going to be longer. But if it's going to be a fast game, someone upgrades movement early, most people aren't building their buildings on the board and you can just zip around. It changes the math and the efficiency of your potential to achieve the objectives. And I like that it sort of forces you to think about what other people are doing at least a little bit.
Yeah.
It's cool.
And then moving on to the delivery, where you get points for delivering unique cows. So you won't get points for double black cows. You'll only get to score the black cows you have once. I really like that. To me, I feel like the handcrafting that happens is like the fun, unique thing about this game. Like that's kind of, to me, the hook of it. And I think it also is what creates the most excitement in the game, where you kind of have these like moments that, they're not like super crazy jackpots, but it feels like a little bit of a jackpot when you get to the last space, or maybe you have an exchange token so you can discard 2 cards and you're really hoping to get a certain high value cow, or maybe just like not a gray cow, please, in order to achieve a certain point value with your hand that unlocks your ability to go to a valuable station. That feels like really fun and satisfying when your kind of plan comes together right at the end.
I like too that, well, 2 things. One, I've heard people pitch this as deck building, and I really don't feel like it is. There is this element of adding new cards to your deck, but to me, the more prioritized thing, because you only play your hand down all at once at the end of a loop, feels like hand management. So I'd call it like a hand management system where you're augmenting your deck more than like
Me too.
a deck building game. But I think the delivery system, where the more valuable your hand is, the further you get to move down this track, and you're getting more rewarding, you're getting more victory points, or you're getting the ability to enhance your board, which is really early game. That's what matters so much to you. You want to land on one of those vital sort of black outline spaces.
Oh, it's huge. It's early on.
Chicago and Toledo, if you can on your second loop or third loop deliver to Chicago and upgrade something, it's massive.
I think that can really lead to like these snowballing victories in the game too.
Definitely. Definitely. And I like situations, Jake, where like the game, maybe because these are in two value increments, right? Like maybe early on you get, and you get points for delivering to two spaces next to each other. Usually just delivering to a single space doesn't necessarily give you points. So for example, if you fill in 10 and 12, Chicago and Toledo, you'll get 6 victory points. If you just go to Chicago, you won't get any. Right. So over the game, it's sort of saying, where do you think you're going on average? Do you think you're going up? Do you think this was a high point for your deck and it's being tough to go up again? And I think that's interesting when decisions come up like that, where it's like, maybe I have something on 10 and 12, and then I get a 14. Well, I'm going to do it there. Do you get what I'm saying? Maybe there's an interesting gap.
There
and
is.
I have to decide if I'm going up or going down. And I can deliver slightly more inefficiently if I think I don't need the money and I need the points.
Like if you have 6, and now you have the ability to go to 10, like you're probably taking it, but that means you're gonna really want to try and fill in 8 at some point later in the game. Or maybe you have just like an astronomically high one where it's like, okay, I could just like go hit like 16 now or something, but like what are the odds I'm gonna then be able to fill in to that or around that? I see what you're saying.
This also plays into an important change between the first edition and this edition, which is that you can opt to deliver to Kansas City, which is just the destination of the trail. You show up and you're like, okay, we're done. We're not trying to ship our cattle anywhere else. And if you do this, you get a nice little bonus of gold, of money. But you lose 6 victory points. And in the early version of this game, you receive more gold because it was so powerful that people would just go and deliver to Kansas City over and over again because having the gold was really valuable. I think that still happens in the second edition of Great Western Trail, and it's still really good. I find myself, there's some games where I'll just give myself negative 12 points so I can have that early game money, because if it sets me up to double buy employees, that's just so big that it doesn't matter.
I think it's hard to pass on it at least once.
Yeah,
that was one of the questions Up Manatee in our Discord asked that we touched on, which is specifically like, do you go to that space? Do you think it's
at least value? Once?
Yeah, that's how I feel too.
I also think that, to me, this offers some of the most interesting tactical decisions in the game. That's an interesting tactical question. Given the game state right now, do I deliver to Kansas City? What if I have a really crappy hand and I have 4? Do I just go to Kansas City again, or do I just accept that I'm going to have to deliver to St. Louis and I'm not getting value for it? And then what? Am I going to then deliver to the one at 6 and like I'm going to get these crap rewards? So there's an interesting, like, do I double down? Can I make it better by going here? And also, if you deliver to New York, it feels like an achievement. That's the one really all the way at the end. Yeah. And it's awesome. It's like, I love that moment. That's a high moment in this game. And it doesn't come from a decision, but it comes as the sort of culmination of all the decisions you made in a way that feels really rewarding, which I want in strategic games, right? I want long-term payoffs for the strategies I've gone down. They shouldn't just be incremental. It should be this really big, hooray, you did it moment.
Right.
And you get that in this game. It comes to the fruition and you get to see it maybe happening. Your hand's getting there. Am I going to draw the 5 that I need to get me there? You top deck it after discarding 2. That feels awesome. And that's, for me, like some of the strength of Great Western Trail, and also why I like playing Cowboys.
Yeah, I think that's one of the ways. That's how the Cowboys steamrolls, and I think the way the Engineers steamrolls is like you have these plays of this game where you can also, as you move your train down the track, you can go to these different stations.
Yes.
And I've had plays this game where it just feels like, for whatever reason, the board is set up in a way that I'm just able to get first to every early station. And when you do that, you get some immediate bonus. And you can also put down one of the workers you currently have to get a long-term benefit, which can be
leave them behind.
Yeah, you just leave behind. You're like, you work here now, I guess, and you work for me.
You establish a branch.
Yeah, that's right. And so some of them, it's like you get permanent, like your hands are always worth 1 for the rest of the game.
Yeah. The certificates.
The certificate
enhance you.
Yeah, and also like it can also be end of game scoring. So it just does everything you want. And I've had like fun plays where I'm like going engineers and I just keep buying engineers and dropping off engineers. And every time you get a new engineer, you also get a benefit from adding them to you. So like the value is just like, it just seems really crazy. insane to the point where it's if that path strategically is open to me, like I just it makes me feel, and I'm like, okay, I'll try builders, and then I'm just like, why did I do
Well, one
that?
thing I love about that system too, Jake, is that it plays with everyone has their own player board, and whenever you buy an employee, there's a chance that the spot you add them to is going to let you do a special effect. So if and some of the effects on the engineer track, like the third engineer you buy, you just get to hire someone at a discount of 2, which is really effective. So if you can put down 3 engineers, get a hiring discount, and hire maybe a cowboy to make your deliveries more efficient, then you can make a delivery, leave an engineer there, so you uncover that bonus spot that if you buy another engineer and put them down, you're going to buy at a discount. That's a really efficient loop that you can end up in that's fun. And I like that this strategy allows you to play with that bonus action system.
Yeah,
Okay, but
definitely.
so cowboys are just like cowboys. They're the basic strat, I think, in a lot of ways, right? They're like the peanut butter. I think that engineers are really cool because they play with this other track part of the board and they loop into cowboys in that way. But I think builders are so fun, Jake. I think you're sleeping on them because they have this whole way that they interact with the hazard system and everyone else gets to suffer and all your spaces are so cool. Like everyone else is like sleeping out in the wilderness and you have these amazing, chateaus that you're going to stay at with your herd.
I like another question that we got is sort of like how the different strategies play into each other.
Yeah.
So I think like a lot of times, like you're doing engineers splashing cowboys, or you're doing like cowboys splashing builders. So like because you want to get to the end of the track and build them all, because then you get a ton of victory points at the end by
Yep.
having a fifth and sixth worker down on the board. So I really do like my favorite strategies have been engineers splash builders or cowboys splash builders. So like it seems like you get a lot of value by buying one or two builders so that you can get some early buildings down, which
Yep.
is going to just like bother your opponents and give you some like small incremental cash over the course of the game. But like I haven't found for me like when I'm doing mostly builders, right? Keep layers like get builders to the end. Like that hasn't been successful to me. Like builders splash something else.
I really like builders. If you can do builders and splashing engineers is a little bit harder, but I think splashing cowboys really works well. Where you just do a little bit, but I also like going all in builders and all in on engineers, or a little bit of builders and a lot of engineers. Building 6A is a pretty cool one, especially if building 5B is in the game. These buildings, 5B lets you get as much money as you have engineers, and 6A lets you move your train as many spaces as you have engineers. So if you can go an early builder to get those buildings out efficiently, then pivot to engineers, you could just be like rolling in dough. Your railroad is zipping down the track, and you're ruling the whole West. It feels great,
That's
and I
cool.
like that that's not available in all games too, right? Like there's certain strategies that the setup of the game says this strategy is emphasized and this strategy is de-emphasized, which I've basically already said, but it's an
Yeah.
important point.
Yeah, and sometimes like with the one or two builder strategies, like I don't even care what building I put somewhere. Like I'm probably
I'm
not going
trying
to
to
use it.
upgrade.
I'm trying to upgrade it, or just like even just like everybody's going to have to go buy this, and it's going to slow them down that one step.
Yep.
It can be good in and of itself.
Okay, can we
Um,
talk really quickly about one more building?
okay,
Okay, the
one more.
mansion, 11A, the 20-point building. This to me is the sort of like other version of delivering to New York, right? If you play builders and you get to slap down this building that gives you 20 victory points and lets you remove 2 hazards from the board for $2 each, potentially getting you the payout of spending $4 and getting 8 victory points in Great Western Trail, that just feels amazing. And sometimes you get to do it twice. And then the analogous home run for engineers is, of course, getting to the final location at the very end of the track, station 10, where you get 9 victory points. That's another like, okay, I hit a home run in some ways. And I
Yeah,
like that there's home runs that you can hit out of the park with all strategic paths.
yeah. And interestingly, like my strategies haven't culminated with those big payoffs as much as like it's just the efficiency you kind of get along the way. Like on your
Yeah,
way to the 9 point station, like you're hitting the 7 point station and the
sure.
5 point station, right? And it's like almost
Yeah.
like
It's more incremental with engineers
yeah.
for
And the
sure.
same with the Cowboys, right? Where it's like the real value to me is like being able to get those like black delivery cities first, like
Sure.
early on, right? And that
And
sets you up for later.
getting a bunch of money from strong deliveries where maybe
Right,
your
exactly.
engineers move down. Yep.
Where it almost matters less achieving that goal, but it is fun that it has the ability to do it.
Yep.
We're kind of coming to the end of this. I think one, just not to end on like a negative note, like, but what do you think of the actual like worker market? Because I think it's kind of just needlessly complex and strange and doesn't really add a lot of value.
Mm.
Where it's just, it's like, yeah, you can look at it and it's just weird to me. Like, okay, I have to pick like between a worker and a hazard. And when you pick a hazard, it seems like often really obvious where you want to place it because you don't want to increase the value of your opponent's buildings. And then like you have different workers that's like, okay, I'll put these out here, but now I can't even buy them right away. So I guess I just do the one I don't want or whatever, right? I don't feel like the decisions are interesting. It seems like it adds a ton of complexity to the game. And if anything, like I feel like what does it matter that it's just weird that like they
I
have all
think
these like vastly different costs.
I think that can be hugely impactful. I think the game needs to have a way to incentivize you to want to deliver quickly. So it does that through the job market. And it also has to have a way to incentivize, like, I'm the one who gets to say what happens with those hazards, right? Like, if I'm going builders, I need my southern strategy, my clear path on the bottom with those water ones to be clear. So it gives me an incentive to do suboptimal things and make some interesting tactical decisions where I pass up efficiency on the board this loop to ensure I keep my efficiency high over the course of a few turns. And I like that the board looking there gives you a sense for what people aren't doing in terms of employees that are left, because it's what's remaining. Though you still have to look at your opponent's boards. I agree that it's complex and the varying cost. In some ways, I think what I'm hearing you say, Jake, is you're like, I wish that placing these were really interesting tactical decisions of impact. And instead, I feel like they're little eddies of strategic bumps that sort of in their totality wash over the game and really do matter. But you don't have those exciting moments where you're like, I get to deliver and it's this amazing tactical moment where
Yeah,
I'm deciding these special things.
the tactical payoff is not equivalent to the complexity. I remember like learning this game in the first time, especially the first time I played it in person. I was just like learning at a game night, and it was just like it is like so freaking confusing to me.
It
Like,
feels like a bookkeeping moment in a lot of
right,
ways.
it's
Yeah.
just fiddly. It's just fiddly, and it just makes me say like, why? I don't know. I
Yeah.
think it'd be interesting if in future iterations of this game, if that was one of the areas of innovation. Like, let's try something different with how these workers come out.
What do you think about the cattle market being refilled being linked to that? Because I do think for me, I found those decisions can be interesting. If I'm not playing cows or if I am playing cows, sometimes I'm like, I'm just going to throw down the engineers and these builders, even though I could be instead going with a different option. I could be not giving my opponents employees they need, but I need this market refilled. So I'll do that. And it creates these trade-offs.
I think it's pretty rare. I think that you'd actually come into this situation where that's like a super meaningful trade off. And at most, it's just because like I think it'd be more interesting if like the other thing you weren't selecting was discarded or something like that. But
Yeah.
because it's
Yeah.
still just sitting there, it's just like it's going to be like what, one or two turns before the person gets there who wants it and puts it down anyway.
Sure.
Sure, and like that can be all the difference in the world, but like in the moment of like making decisions, I just like, okay, it just doesn't feel
This is what it is.
impactful or fun in the way that I feel like so many of these tactical I in so many of these like I guess like efficiency puzzle games, which this also is just from a more strategic lens,
Yeah.
do in a more fun and intuitive way. But it's really a small critique.
Yeah, definitely. What's your favorite player count to play this at, Jake? Because they all feel pretty different because
They
the
do
board
feel
doesn't
different.
scale.
I don't really have a preference. I haven't. I normally I'm like, okay, I've really enjoyed my plays at this count more than other, but to be honest, like I don't feel like they do. They feel different just because like the board changes so much more and gets so
Yep.
much more cluttered. But like going back to my very first thought about like the actual decision space, like that doesn't feel that different to
That
me.
different. I think that for me, I think that if I'm thinking like the best way that if I was going to show someone Great Western Trail and I want them to experience it in its optimal form, it's 3 players. And I think there's some harmony and some like aesthetically pleasing aspects of like the 3 strategic paths.
Everyone gets one strategic path as Pfister intended and just pursues it to the end, and we'll see who wins.
The board doesn't feel like massively open. There's a little bit of competition and choke points, but it's not totally clogged and like my arteries are destroyed. So yeah, for me, it's 3. 2's good. I like it. 4's fine. But I'd probably, if I was offered to play Great Western Trail at 4 or something else that I liked the game just as much, I'd probably pick the other game.
I think that's it. Brendan, do you have any final thoughts on this game?
Broom Service is still Alexander Pfister's best game. You should play that. It's awesome. Great Western Trail.
I'm not a Pfister hater because I love Broom Service.
Great
and Isle of Skye.
We had to stand for it a little bit on the podcast because I think we feel like people don't appreciate Broom Service in the way they should. And I think that Great Western Trail is awesome. I get why it's really popular. I want to keep playing it. I think that there's valid criticism of this game. It is not, in my mind, the best game ever designed. But it's great. It's good. I really like it.
Yeah. And I mean, if you love Great Western Trail, come in our Discord, tell us why. I know I'm in the, vast minority of people. This is one of the top rated board games of all time, widely beloved and, loved after countless plays by folks. So if that's you, don't let me stand in the way of it. I hope that you very much enjoyed our conversation about it. And we'd love to hear what we got right, what we got wrong. And you can do that in our Discord. We will always share a link to join our Discord, an online chat room, in the show notes of this podcast, the description of this podcast. We can also be found on Twitter at DecisionSPA. Brendan is at BurnsideBH, and I am at Jake Freed. That's JakeFryd. Let's see. We already mentioned the Patreon. Anything else I'm forgetting, Brendan? We got a website.
We do. DecisionspacePodcast.com. Go there. Yeah. It's good.
What's happening next week?
Tigris and Euphrates. We'll see if the podcast survives next week.
Yeah. So join us next week for what it will undoubtedly be the last episode of Decision Space ever. Just kidding. Thanks so much for listening, and we will see you next week. Thanks as always to Hembry for our intro and outro song, Reach Out.
Yeehaw!
Yeehaw!